Let's talk now to Alex South, who's an author and a former prison officer. Alex, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, look, it feels like a no-brainer, and I just wonder why it hasn't been done before.
I agree. I think there's been so much rhetoric recently, hasn't there, around is punishment the most appropriate thing? Is it control, compassion, rehabilitation? But I don't actually think that you can have any of them if you don't have education, decent training, decent skills provision. I mean, you mentioned earlier, what exactly is it that we hope to have? We want less victims in society. So I think we need to do something in prison that adequately contributes to that. We need people to leave prison with the skills to help them desist from crime, because that's ultimately what's going to lead to less victims. Certainly, in my opinion, having spent a considerable period of time in prison, not only does it make life a lot easier for the staff, it gives the prisoners a purpose to their day. It gives them a way to engage with the outside world, to learn when they're obviously very restricted in doing that inside. So it makes things flow much more functionally in prison. And that's the kind of atmosphere you need to encourage someone to leave and contribute to society in the same way.
What level of education are we talking about? I mean, the reason I mentioned university, and that might have made you smile, level university, because I remember when the student riots happened, there was a young man who did something extremely wrong and he ended up in prison. And the country paid for his university education, whereas all the kids that didn't break the law had to pay for their own and go into debt. So there is a sense at some point that justice has to be served as well. But talk me through about what kind of education are you thinking about when you hear that?
Well, it's really dependent on the kind of jail that you're talking. So when I first joined the service, I went to a high security men's prison. The overwhelming majority of guys there were lifers, so the average sentence on my wing was around 27 years. And in that prison, they did facilitate open university degrees, so postgraduate education across a whole range of subjects. And like you say, it was for free for the prisoners. And it's a really contentious issue, and it should be, especially considering how much education costs for people in society. And I don't think you can get away from that. It's always going to rub people up the wrong way, and understandably so. I mean, at the time I was at that prison, I was actually doing an open university degree myself. So I remember having very similar feelings to the ones you've just described, that I was paying however much a month, and they certainly weren't. But I saw the very real immediate impact of that. It benefits people in prison, and I believe that it honestly benefits them outside as well. If we have people leaving prison with very little skills, very little way to get them a job, and that's the big thing here that we're talking about. People don't have jobs to get, people don't have access to those opportunities. They're more likely to commit crime. But having said that, I then moved on to a short-termers jail in central London, where there was little to no provision for education. And the irony of that is that this was a short-term prison jail. So this is where prisoners can be released in anything from 2 weeks to a couple of years. But there was no provision for education for them. So the irony of that is we were giving the long-termers, who had a minimum of 25, 30, some over 40 years to serve before they were released, they had access to really high-quality postgraduate education, whereas the guys who were getting out in a couple of months had little to nothing. And I think that indicates how fractured our system is at the moment. If we want to do what actually works, we need to implement that in our prisons and in the education departments.
It is a really, like you said, it's a contentious issue and a difficult one, because you do have people who say, well, look, my kid has never broken the law. You know, he or she has been a victim of crime, and they are having to pay for their own education, whereas the perpetrator of that crime is going into jail for 6 years and is getting a free post-grad degree, or, you know, and that actually is galling. It is galling when you're a taxpayer, your whole family have been working and paying tax, and you've got a situation where the victim of the crime is paying for their own education and the perpetrator of the crime is getting a free education. That is annoying.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even as you're saying it, I can feel myself kind of reacting in that way. It is annoying. Yeah. It is. Sorry, go on.
And I was just going to say, well, how do we convince people that prison shouldn't be about punishment, that they're really just in like a boarding school? I mean, you know, where people have to call them by their first name, they get to play pool in the evening. it does sound like a private education, right, to some degree.
Well, I can happily dispel that notion for you. Prison is absolutely not like a private education. Prison is absolutely not a holiday camp. I think sometimes we come to it with a really binary view. So prisons are either very soft, overly compassionate, they're having degrees, they're having pool tournaments in the evening, or there's the other aspect of it, that they're really tough regimes enforced and characterised by punishment. That's not what prison is like. It's not a case of only having one and not having the other. You can still provide someone with decent training, decent education, and still robustly challenge poor behaviour. You can still have very firm regimes. You can still have very clear, demarcated consequences for violence, for poor antisocial behaviour. And our system's very good at that, you know, and that does absolutely go on. It's not a case of, if you are compassionate towards someone's situation, then you therefore condone their crime and condone any poor behaviour in prison. I think what we're trying to do is blend punishment, because that's important. It's important for society to see that, particularly with really abhorrent crimes. I mean, we have the full life sentence that demonstrates that clearly. So punishment is important, I think, symbolically, for people to see that as well. But I think if you just have punishment, if you just stick people in a room for 24 hours a day, if you have them in very poor conditions, if you offer them nothing, then what honestly do you expect to happen when they're released? Because they will be released. Life sentence prisoners do get out. It's not an indeterminate sentence. So I think the broader question has to be, what is it that we want? When we talk about victims of society and thinking that that's unfair, victims of crime, what do those victims ultimately want? Of course, punishment. So they should. That's right and just. But I think most people would say, and I also don't want them to do it again. And we have to look at the evidence of suggest what actually works, what's effective. But locking people in dark rooms for, you know, days, weeks, months on end, it doesn't work. And I know that because I've been there with the 24-hour bang-up regime in two of the prisons I worked at. It doesn't work.
Could we start, because that dichotomy between victim and perpetrator, saying supporting victims in the same way that we're trying to support prisoners, because, you know, victims may find it difficult to walk into a college because they've been traumatised, or they may find it difficult to get a job because they've been traumatised, particularly of violent crime or sexual crime. And yet the victims, we pay lip service to the idea that there's victim support. There really isn't. It is not as good as the support and the bleeding hearts that we see that gather around prisons.
Well, I absolutely agree that victim support is really lacking. I think that goes without saying. There's some really amazing third sector organisations that try to fill that gap, but that in itself kind of identifies the problem. There is a gap. The policies aren't there to fill it. I don't know if I agree with the second part of what you said, that people are sort of gathering around prisons. I mean, trust me, prisons are really tough places to be at the minute, and that's evidenced by the amount of suicides that we have, not just with prisoners, but prison officers taking their own lives. It's evidenced by the fact we can't recruit staff, we certainly can't retain them. The rates of staff sickness, staff suffering very serious traumatic and mental health related issues. That evidences the fact that not only are these extremely difficult conditions for prisoners to be living in, but they're really tough conditions for officers who you're hoping to do this transformative, meaningful, life-changing work, and we're asking them to work in very poor conditions. So,
but we have to be careful. We have to be careful, don't we? That what we're not doing is giving these prisoners an education to make the prison guards' life easier, in a sense. You know, if prisoners are easier to control because they're on drugs, we hear, then there's a blind eye turned sometimes to that. I did a phone-in once where prisoners were explaining to me how they got things into prison, and it was the funniest and most shocking phone-in I've done in my career, I think. Again, the public wouldn't be forgiving of that.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said about the contraband. I certainly won't look at a dead pigeon in the same way as I used to.
Or a small mobile phone.
Smaller than that. Yeah, you don't want to know where that is.
I found out. Yeah.
Having said that, I don't know who's told you that having lots of drugs in prison makes prison easier. It absolutely does not. Lots of drugs in prison makes them extremely dangerous, makes them extremely dysfunctional environments. The kinds of violence that I have seen come not just from immediate drug usage, but the bullying that entails, the subculture that goes on. You have one prisoner I met in one prison, he was pretty candid with me and said he was making upwards of $4,000 a week. And so while he might be making a lot of money from it, imagine the problems that then come with the amount of people who owe him money, the amount of people who can't get that money, the amount of people who want to rob him and take that money. It leads to enormous levels of violence, bullying. It leads to suicide. It leads to prisoner-on-prisoner homicide who are under the influence of drugs or have drug-induced psychosis.
How is it impossible to stop it? I mean, they're supposed to be stopping things getting out, but it seems that there's no thought given to stopping things coming in.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the prisons that I worked in, it was a grade 2 listed building, which meant that they couldn't make modifications to the exterior. So there were no cages on the window. So weekly we would see drones arrive and they literally just drop off parcels. So the idea that, I mean, obviously I mentioned dead rats, dead pigeons, they would be gutted, filled with drugs, sewed back up. You know, it's not for want of staff not trying. You can have all the staff in the world running around every day, but if someone can literally just guide a drone to a window and drop something off, we need something bigger than just the individual motivation of officers. We need policies to support that. We need decent infrastructure. We need, you know, actual modifications made to buildings that are not fit for purpose in contemporary society when people can operate these kind of drones. So it's a really difficult one. But, you know, trust me, drugs make prison dangerous. They make prison frightening. They cause people to inflict serious harm on others. They cause people to leave prison with worsened addictions or addictions that they didn't have in the first place, which, as we know, drug fuels crime. The idea that drugs make prison a calmer place and that officers are turning a blind eye, I haven't met those officers. That's certainly not my experience.
That is fantastic to hear, because then I'll be able to quote that, because I've always wondered about, you know, people if they're smoking weed, but you can smell it. I mean, just walk down Notting Hill, but you know, and how that isn't stopped, you know. But I guess they're vaping it now, or they're finding different ways to do it. It's been fascinating to talk to you,